right, well, I'm at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, and I have the pleasure of meeting my friend Lewis Bartlett once again for an interview. Lewis is spearheading, I don't know if you want to call it the search for the yellow-legged hornet here in Georgia, and you're working pretty closely with the USDA, is that right?
Partly with the USDA, yes. A lot of the search effort is being led by the Georgia Department of Agriculture, and I'm coordinating a lot of the what I'd call research support of the eradication effort. So the science that needs to be done to back up their search and destroy mission, that's been led by myself with quite a lot of collaborators here at the university, as well as in neighbouring states of Florida and South Carolina. I'm
a little bit ignorant on the subject, so I don't have a lot of questions to ask. I'm just going to let you tell us as much as you can. Tell us about your involvement, the USDA's involvement. I heard they found one hornet in South Carolina. Maybe you can elaborate on all of that. And then in the end, I want to know just how dangerous this is for the bees.
Yeah, so to take it way back, when I was first getting into beekeeping research, that was back in Britain, in Cornwall, that we were just talking about off camera. That was right around in the early kind of 2000 and teens, 2015, around there. The yellow-legged hornet was spilling over from its invasive range in France and Europe into the south of England. So my experience with these things actually goes way back to when I was still on the other side of the Atlantic, and I was lucky enough to be on the same campus as Dr. Pete Kennedy, who has been leading much of the response in Britain. So these were animals I was already familiar with, even though I never really expected them to follow me to the US when I moved my career here. But we know that they're invasive in Europe, and we know they're invasive in parts of Asia, so they're in Korea and they're in Japan, but they shouldn't be there. We know it's from Asia generally, but there's lots of parts of Asia where it shouldn't be that it has also got to and caused a problem. So a lot of what we know about it is from where it's been studied in these problem cases in Japan, in Korea, and in Europe. So it's been on our radar as something that might arrive, especially when the giant hornet, the so-called killer hornet, arrived in Washington. There was a lot of effort spent looking for what other incidences like that we need to be aware of, and this was on that list. So it wasn't entirely surprising when the first individual was found and identified in Savannah, but it was a case that we needed to jump on quite quickly. The earlier we catch these invasive species, the more capable we are of controlling and hemming them in and then eradicating them. The detection of the first one was back in August of this year.
Yeah, 2023. Today's November 29th, by the way.
Yeah, so we're speaking right at the end of November right now. Obviously, this is kind of an ever-evolving situation, so I'm going to say what I can about what we know right now, but in another month or 2 months' time, that might have changed a little bit. So the first specimen was found by a beekeeper, by a first-year beekeeper. He'd got his first colonies in March, and we're so used to with the new beekeepers telling them, hey, there's all this crazy stuff out there, but you don't need to worry about that, just learn the basics. But he was astute enough to see this insect in his bee yard, attacking his bees, and thought, I really don't recognize that that's anything I'm supposed to be aware of. He caught it. It made its way here to UGA, to our Natural History Museum. So the Georgia Natural History Museum is housed here on the Athens campus at the University of Georgia, and they're the ones that have to confirm the identity at the state level of these things. And I was in Keith Delaplane's office, who's the co-director of the Bee Lab here with me, when he got the call from our curator of invertebrates at the museum, Rick, saying, yes, it's definitely a yellow-legged hornet. And at that point, we were getting reports from Savannah, particularly from Savannah Bee Company, that their apiaries were being raided and attacked by lots of these hornets. And so that was back in August. And that's the point then where the response effort really kicked off. And the Georgia Department of Agriculture took it very seriously. They are working to eradicate this, and they've been very open to collaborating with us at the university as much as everyone's capable of. So
it's really hard to eradicate something. How many finds were there? How many nests were found?
So far there have been 5 nests located and destroyed. All within
Did you hear about the South Carolina find? What's that? Is that a nest? Or?
No, the find in South Carolina, and I need to give Ben Powell, who's my equivalent at Clemson, over there a call. But as far as I'm aware, the find in South Carolina was just of an individual forager. And we know that these things can fly, as far as honeybees, potentially a couple of miles in search of food. It was right by the river, right by the Savannah River. And we know that there's been nests up towards the river. So for now, I am operating under the assumption that that was a Georgia-born hornet that had simply flown over the river as part of its foraging, and that we can't at this stage say definitively that there are nests in South Carolina. Now they might be, but if they are, they're going to be right there along the Georgia border. All the nests that have been found and destroyed so far are from a very limited geographic area, a circle of about 2 miles radius or so.
Oh, okay.
So we're not even talking about the whole of Savannah at this point. We're talking about a very restricted district that suggests to me so far that this is the first generation of nests from queens that were born here in the US. So our current best hypothesis is that last year a queen came over on a cargo ship, we assume, in a cargo container, founded one nest, raised her daughters, her progeny, and then it's that first generation of daughters of queens that she raised that we're now seeing their nests. So we think this is the first year that there's been a full reproductive cycle, just because of how geographically limited the nests we're finding are, which means we've caught it extremely early. To catch an invasive species in its first year is unusual, really.
Yeah.
Which is why I think there's a strong case for us being able to eradicate it, because we're only operating on a very limited area right now.
Well, just how bad is this thing? I mean, what's the ramifications of this populating the area?
So we don't know how far it would spread in the US. We've done some genetic work to test where it's from. Now, it's not the same subtype, we'll say, that they have in Europe. This has definitely come from somewhere in Asia, but we can't say right now whether it's come from the invasive populations that are in Japan or Korea, or if it's from the native range in kind of south-central China. And depending on exactly what subtype we've got, we'll be able to say how far it might be able to spread, depending on its temperature tolerance, and also hopefully how fast. And that's work that we're doing here at UGA right now, is to model, to project how fast it may invade across the state and the country if we're not controlling it.
What does it do to a beehive?
So they are active predators of foraging honeybees, and the way they coordinate that is once they've located a hive or an apiary, they will hawk. The behaviour is called. They'll hawk outside the entrance, so they'll turn a few feet from the front of the hive, and they'll track visually foragers returning to the colony, and they'll essentially learn those flight paths, and then they'll intercept the returning foragers mid-flight.
Before they even hit the landing board.
Yes, so the hornets themselves aren't actually ever really alighting on or entering the hive unless it's a hive that they've really already depleted. If they kill enough of the bees that the colony's dying, then they'll maybe walk in. But this isn't like the giant hornet where they're kind of invading and forcing their way into the colony. They're just hanging out at the front and intercepting the bees as they return, and then taking those bees home to feed their larvae. And what they can do, as far as we're aware, much in the same way as the giant hornet, is they can communicate to the other foragers in their nests, so the other hornets, where that apiary is and recruit other individuals. And at that point, you might be losing potentially hundreds of forager bees per day to these hornets, and that creates a problem for the colony, obviously, that looks actually a little bit like CCD, like a colony collapse disorder.
Bees disappear.
Where you're just losing all the adult bees. You know, the nurse bees then accelerate their aging. The nurse bees accelerate their aging to replace those foragers, and you lose all your adult bees, but you've still got brood and a queen because they're never really going into the colony. That means it's really difficult for beekeepers to do much about this, because you can't keep them out of the apiary. You can put an entrance reducer on a colony as we would for a giant hornet, but that does nothing when the hornets are intercepting the bees outside the hive. And that's why they're so difficult to control from a beekeeping perspective, because there's very little we can do in our apiaries beyond putting out bait traps for these hornets that will control them. So it really needs to be a kind of land. This is everyone's problem, right? No individual beekeeper is going to be able to say, oh, well, I don't get a problem with hornets because I do this, this, and this, because there's no real solution that we can do at the apiary level. It has to be getting rid of the nests in the local neighborhood.
Has there been work done with bait stations and things for these things, or?
Yes, so there's a lot of work being done on what they're attracted to. The adult hornets, just like any yellow jackets or hornets, don't really eat meat themselves. They're sugar feeders. They're only hunting insects to feed to their larvae. And so any kind of sugar bait, you know, juice, fermenting fruit, will attract the hornets, and that's an easy way to detect them.
It'll attract everything else that
it will. Yes,
Yellow-jackets.
exactly. It will. It will attract. It'll even attract bees, right? If you put out fruit juice, your bees are going to get into that, which means we really don't want to go down the lethal bait stations, right? Those bait stations are useful for being able to tell if you have hornets. It's a very dangerous game to then fill that with, say, fipronil or any other pesticide, because you're going to hit everything else in the area, potentially including your bees, wild bees, your neighbour's bees, who knows. And really, we don't want to be killing the foragers anyway, because we need those to lead us back to the nest. So that's really what the effort right now with the search and destroy eradication is about, is when hornets are detected, using them to point to where their home nest is. And the Department of Ag have so far been working on very simple but effective triangulation, where they mark these hornets, they give them a piece of meat, let the hornet fly back to its nest, deliver that piece of meat, and then it'll return to exactly where you caught it, because that's a good hunting ground. And if you time that a couple of times and you watch what direction she's flying off in, if you can do that from 2 or 3 different apiaries where you have a time measure and a direction, you can just see then where those lines should intercept on a map and say that's about where this nest is. Now, there's more sophisticated things we can do that have been developed in Europe, especially in Britain, where we can attach a radio transmitter, essentially a tag, to these hornets, and then use that to follow them back to the nest.
Okay, so far 5 nests? Am I correct?
5 nests, yeah.
Okay. Well, it sounds somewhat hopeful. You know, my experience with eradicating pests, you know, I was a bee inspector in Oregon when they found the tracheomites.
And we've talked about that together before, the tracheomite. I
think a different situation.
Very different situation when the bees aren't carrying these things with them, right? So containment's much easier. So far, we haven't seen evidence of early reproduction. We think they are probably waiting, that if there aren't nests still out there, which there may well be. We suspect there's probably a couple.
Well, what happens in the winter? Do they explain the nest in the winter?
So normally, the nest will die off around this time of year, now that it gets cold, in the same way that your yellow jacket nests and your bald-faced hornets and your European hornets die off. And prior to that, that's when they'll produce their reproductive. So they'll produce their males and they'll produce their future queens. They'll mate with one another, and then just the queens will hibernate over winter, very similar to bumblebees. But that's mostly based on them being studied in slightly colder regions like Europe, as well as parts of Korea and Japan. And there's some evidence from their native range in Southeast Asia, where it's tropical especially, that they're capable of actually surviving and reproducing multiple years and throughout the year in these more tropical regions where there's not a winter. Now, what we don't know is whether savanna and kind of the southeast coast is going to get cold enough to push those hives into dying off over the winter, or whether we're going to see this multi-year persistence of singular colonies. So that's a question we're trying to answer.
So midwinter is you can't really search and destroy them.
No, we wouldn't. Well, even if the colonies are alive in midwinter, it's probably going to be too cold for them to be out foraging, you know?
Just
in which case we can't find them because there's no hornets out and about to point to the direction.
This really sounds to me like a beekeeper. Your beekeepers are your first line of defense.
Line of defense. I completely agree, Bob. So some work we've already started on. We're doing a lot of genetics, and I can talk in detail or give a quick overview about all the different bits of science that we're doing, from invasion modelling to seeing what else they're eating to tracing exactly how well mated that first queen was, all of that. But right now, in my opinion, the most important bit of science we're doing is collaborative work with Jamie Ellis down in Florida and Dr. Lee Boardman, now at University of Memphis in Tennessee, where they already had a funded grant to use what we call environmental DNA to detect new diseases or new parasites in colonies. And with this being so close to them down in Florida, Savannah's closer to Gainesville than it is Athens, we've been able to work together to test whether we can swab, to some degree, the colony itself, but in my opinion, much more importantly, these non-lethal bait traps with essentially something that looks just like a throat swab that you might use to get a flu test, and whether we can detect the DNA of these hornets just in the environment without having to see them. And what I am hoping, if we get the funding to do it, either from NSF or USDA, federal funding's slow at the moment because and I'm not a voter, so I stay out of US politics, but budgets are apparently difficult for the federal government to decide on at the moment, and so things are moving very slowly when we need funding for this right now.
I'm sure it's taking a ton of money.
It's not cheap. It really isn't. This kind of genetics work is very powerful and very useful, but it's very new, and these new things are often a bit more expensive. But the beekeepers are the first line of defense, as you said, and what I would really like to see is beekeepers putting out these sugar solution, these fruit juice bait stations.
Can you provide me with a really good picture that I can put in this video?
I have one. So this is an example of the simplicity of those bait traps. So this one's produced by Vita Pharma back in Europe. This was actually given to me by Virginia Webb, who's one of our beekeepers here in North Georgia, that she brought back from Apimundia in Chile. But the idea that I would like to see is these rolled out where beekeepers can essentially make something like this themselves at home through, very cheap means, very, very inexpensive means. And you can fill this with some kind of sugar solution. And yes, this will trap some hornets. They'll fall in through this aperture here. But more importantly, if hornets and yellow jackets and all these other insects are coming to this to feed on the sugar and they're walking around on the surface here, we can then swab that and test it genetically for whether or not a yellow-legged hornet, specifically this Vespa velutina, has been on this trap. What I would like to see done next year, starting early in the spring, so we have a whole year to find and destroy these things, is for our beekeepers in Chatham County, and the Coastal Empire Beekeepers Association has been very proactive in working with me about this, is to have these in essentially every apiary, not only where the hornets are, but in a buffer zone around it, and for beekeepers to be able to swab this maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks, send that to either a lab here at UGA, down in Florida, wherever's most convenient.
So how do beekeepers get their hands on this thing?
So my plan would be that we'll be sending kits out. What I would like to see is by March, I'll be shipping boxes of these things down to the beekeepers in Savannah.
Is this appropriate for me to get an address from you, or somebody can, or a phone number or an email where they can request a kit?
Not at this point until we've got it set up, if that's all right, okay, Bob.
Sure,
I want to make sure this is done in a proper coordinated response,
okay.
And my email inbox is busy enough already that I don't want people falling through the cracks. But I'll make sure that we
so
we
local
announce
bee
it
clubs
very
will
well.
have it down
yes,
there,
yeah. And really, I think running it through the bee clubs will be the better way to go. And I'll be down in Savannah in February for their Coastal Empire Beekeepers Association meeting as their keynote speaker, where we'll be hopefully launching this.
Yeah.
But the idea then is we're not even relying on seeing the hornet, we can just tell that it's been there. And so if we get a hit with this genetic testing, we can say exactly which trap, which beekeeper sent that sample in, and then we can really coordinate the effort, find that hornet when it returns, hopefully put one of those radio tags on, and it can lead us back to the nest. And I think that combination of beekeepers being our monitoring network married with these modern genetic testing techniques is how we're going to do this. I think next year is going to be our best bet for rolling something like that out, and that's how I at least want to see us get rid of this. Because I'll be very honest with you, Bob, I love working on bees as a scientist. I don't want to spend the next 10 years of my career as a professor being the yellow-legged hornet guy for America. I don't want to have to work on these. I know Jamie Ellis is saying exactly the same. So we're very much bent on getting rid of these things for our sakes as well. I don't want this to be my career.
Well, this sounds doable from what I've heard so far.
I have high hopes that we can, with the right effort and the right support, get rid of this.
Well, I know beekeepers in Georgia are taking this very seriously.
Very seriously.
And I've spoken to a couple of clubs around, even in Tennessee, well, last night before, and they're talking about it, and they're taking it serious. The GBA is taking it quite seriously. They gave you a ton of money.
Yeah, so
I was on that committee, and it was unanimous. All of us, no hesitation.
Which I deeply appreciate. And again, I think that relationship between us here at the university with the beekeepers of Georgia is what really shores up these responses. Because as I mentioned, the federal response is typically not as fast as we'd like, and so but we need to be acting, and so these donations of money basically in support of the research agenda, because this genetics is expensive to do, and so far we've been bankrolling it as professors on our kind of flexible money, but my colleagues in genetics, they don't have any obligation to work on this. You know, I've been calling in favors, and so when GBA can step up and say, well, we'll make sure that you have the money to do the testing you need so we can roll this out in spring, that's really where that changes the game in terms of how achievable this is. So it really has made a huge amount of difference. We're extracting DNA right now from individuals from every colony found so far. We've already confirmed that they're all the same maternal lineage, so evidence is consistent that it was just one queen that arrived on a cargo ship. We're going to be doing some deeper genetic sequencing in collaboration with multiple professors here as well as some folks up at Purdue University, to see if we can detect how inbred they are, which will confirm for us whether this is the first generation, as well as how many males the imported queen had mated with, because they're very variable in how many males they've mated with. And that will also give us a sense of how quickly these things might spread, because if they have very little genetic variation, they're going to be more limited in how adaptable they are.
I'm seeing dollar signs. Now, we gave you $40,000. That's just nothing.
Not for this sort of research, unfortunately. It really is eye-wateringly expensive just running the samples, doing the sequencing. Now, that's a very serious amount of money that we can do reasonable good work with. But the federal grants that we usually use to support this sort of endeavour are in the hundreds of thousands, if not, you know, for a longer term response, more. And that money's there, it's available, it's just not released in as rapid a fashion as is sometimes necessary, and that's where these stopgap pieces of funding really hold everything together.
We need a lobbyist in Washington on this one.
Well, I know the American Honey Producers Association, I believe. I know they have a lobbyist. And I have no doubt that that my colleagues at USDA are taking this very seriously. Yeah. It is ultimately that, you know, the Farm Bill still hasn't been released as a draft by the Senate Ag Committee. Yeah. You know, these things that I don't involve myself in, especially as a non-American, but I have to know about because they directly impact our ability to get on top of problems like this.
All right. All very interesting. Do you think we said all we can say, or have you said all you can say on this?
I think so. I mean, there's details of some of the work we're doing, but that's not important for the beekeepers to necessarily know at this stage. Just that so far it's very contained. I think with the right approach, which we have the capacity for, it's whether or not we have the will and the monetary support and the cooperation between the state agricultural department and the universities. I think we have a solid shot of getting rid of this thanks to the number and willingness of beekeepers, really. In a way, we're lucky it's such a populated area that they've arrived in, that there's so many beekeepers in Savannah and the surrounding counties, because that gives us so many eyes looking out for these things. If this was, you know, further south, if these things were in the Okefenokee swamp, we'd have no chance of finding them. But because of where they are, I have high hopes that we have a shot of getting rid of these things.
Okay. Well, I'll post this, and then I'll say it right now on the video. I would request, especially Georgia beekeepers and perhaps beyond, if they look at this video, to share it with other beekeepers. Awareness is the answer. I know that's what I'm seeing. Awareness is extremely important here. Yeah. So I'll ask people to share this. The word's getting out. They're talking about it. So hopefully within the next few months, beekeepers in this region will be extremely aware and on the lookout.
I think so, indeed.
Well, Lewis, once again,
always
I really
a pleasure,
appreciate
Rob.
your time. Thank you very much for everything you're doing.
It's my pleasure.
We love you in Georgia.
I'm glad to be able to stay here. Every time I try and leave,
no, you ain't going nowhere.
No, I'm very, very happy to be here, and clearly it's where I'm needed.
Right.
I feel a little bit like these things have followed me here, and time to give them the boot.
All right, thanks again. Appreciate it.